Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 3-game college football slate for you. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel a lot. Make sure to check the links in the descriptions for Discord, and you can find out some good things in there, as we have a bunch of cool people in there. And then before I get into the DraftKings slate here, let's get into the sportsbook. So we're going to talk about the 3 games here: MTSU versus Liberty, Western Kentucky versus Jacksonville State, and then Southern Miss versus South Alabama. Now, my 2 picks for the spreads are Western Kentucky -7.5 and USM +18. Now, South Alabama has been 2-4 against the spread this season, and Western Kentucky is 4-2. One of the reasons I picked USM +18 is because South Alabama has been really bad after having a big game the week before throughout the last couple seasons, and so I think the USM is going to take this one, or at least cover it. USM will likely lose, though, so do keep that in mind. But I do think that they're going to cover the spread here. One of the other reasons is they have some good players. It's just they don't have a great offense and defense, generally speaking, as their ratings are pretty low, especially defensively. But overall, Western Kentucky also has a very good matchup here against Jacksonville State. Now, Jacksonville State has been pretty good defensively this season. However, they're going to be missing a lot offensively today, as it looks like their top 2 quarterbacks will likely be out, such as their top running back, and that will really hurt their offense. And even though Western Kentucky has some deficiencies on the defensive side of the ball, I do think that they're going to be able to dominate this game start to finish. So, and Western Kentucky throws the ball a lot, Jacksonville State doesn't, and that's going to hurt Jacksonville State a lot, especially if Western gets ahead early on. So those are my picks for that. As for some of my prop bets, we're going to look at Caden Salter to get more than 1.5 touchdown passes, and then Salter also to get 44.5 rush yards or better. So those are my 2 favorite prop bets for these games as well. And Salter is Liberty's quarterback, just to keep in mind there. I really couldn't figure out much to like about this Liberty MTSU matchup when it comes to the regular bets. So with that said, let's get into the DraftKings aspect of this here now. And we're going to start with our quarterbacks here. So we have, this is probably the most difficult position on the slate today, because there's really legitimately 4 quarterbacks that have some utility here, and then a 5th one that's got some contrarian opportunity as a minimum at a dirt cheap price. But we'll start with our most expensive quarterback in Reed for Western Kentucky. Now, obviously, he's second on this list of quarterbacks and total yards and total passes and total receptions, and he's also first in touchdowns, tied with Salter. And he also does rush the ball a little bit, but not very much. He does face a tougher defensive situation than any of the other quarterbacks, but, I mean, considering the fact that all these games are going to be relatively easy or terrible defensively, he's going to have some pretty open wide receivers throughout this game anyway, and so he's a great option, though he is very expensive today. I think Salter is actually a little bit safer than Reed today, simply because he also gets a huge amount of rushing yards and touchdown potential from that perspective as well. Of course, Liberty doesn't throw the ball as much, or in fact, they throw the ball about as low as anybody on the slate outside of Jacksonville State. And he's got the best quarterback rating of all quarterbacks on the slate, and he's a little bit cheaper than Reed as well, a little bit more consistent, and he also faces a much worse defense on this particular slate. He's had some absolutely monster games this season, and I think he's going to have a big one today. I look for him to have multiple touchdowns in different ways on the slate. Now, then we'll look at Valetito for MTSU. Now, he's in an interesting spot here. He obviously throws the ball quite a bit. He is typically pretty flashy, and he does run the ball some too, though he doesn't get the yards that Salter does. He also has a pretty good matchup as well, just like all the rest of the quarterbacks. And he's been relatively consistent, with his one bad game being against Western Kentucky, and then, of course, the first game of the season against Alabama, which anybody's going to struggle with. But he's been really solid throughout the year, and I think he's got some great upside for this game. I think he'll keep MTSU in the game with his arm and with his ability. So he's somebody I would definitely like here, but there is some risk there, because Liberty is probably one of the better defensive through the past teams that exist on the slate. Then we'll look at Bradley for South Alabama. Now, he's been very good this season. He's also 3rd on this slate in total passes and 3rd in yards. He's also 3rd in touchdowns, tied with Valetito, and he's got the 2nd best quarterback rating of the slate. He doesn't really rush the ball at all, so that doesn't help him on the fantasy perspective. And he actually does face one of the tougher pass defenses on the slate Again, that's relative, to the games that they have here. His average is a little bit lower than some of the other running quarterbacks, but he's also a little bit cheaper than Salter and Reed. I think he's a good option for that S flex, but Vadatito also fits there pretty well. So either one of those guys have very good S flex potential today, but I think you're gonna have to pick between Salter and Reed for your top overall quarterback. Now we do have a contrarian Hail Mary play here as Ashton Fry for Jacksonville State. It's not guaranteed that he's going to start, but it looks like he might be drawing a start today as the result of both Zion Webb and Logan Smothers being out. Both of them are doubtful for this game, so obviously Smothers is more likely to play than Webb is, but they're both doubtful. So I look for Fry to be potentially in this game, and we don't have much to go on as he is a freshman this year. He did play against Liberty for a few attempts, and he had 11 passes and 7 rushing attempts, but he also did fumble the ball once, so do keep that in mind. But he is capable. It looks like, Jacksonville State doesn't pass the ball much, but he'll look to run, and it looks like he is capable of doing that. So he could be interesting, though he is a Hail Mary approach, but he's also minimum price, and so he fits in that S flex at a very cheap price, and really does help you pay up at wide receiver or running back if that's what you want to do. But again, he's very high risk on the slate. But if he has a big game, then he's probably going to be in the perfect lineups on this one. Looking at our running backs here, we have about 4 running backs to choose from for our 2 spots and our flex spot. I think flex is going to be really interesting today with the potential running back situation here because we have 4 legitimate options, and then we have 2 other options that are actually not all that awful, but compared to the top 4 are probably not going to be the best hitters. But we'll start with Cooley today for Liberty. He's obviously had a very good season. He's got some big time upside here. He's got second most rushes on the slate, but he has most yards by by over 100. So, and he has 3 touchdowns on the year as well. But his price is pretty high, which does draw him some difficult to roster here. But I do think that they're going to go to him quite a bit because I think Liberty will get up early on, and they'll probably run the ball a little bit more with him than maybe normal, and that will give him some utility and touchdown potential. Then we'll look at Webb for South Alabama. Now, he's actually got the most touchdowns of any running back on the slate with 8. He's had some monster games this year. His ceiling is pretty high, and his floor is actually pretty good too, though his first game of the season was not very good. After that, he's been solid every game since. And like I said, he's had 8 touchdowns on the year, and he is second on total yards as well with 476 on the year, and he's third in total rushes on the season here. He also does get a few catches through the air, but not very many, and he hasn't had a touchdown that way. He does face a very favorable opportunity from a defensive side of it. He should have a very good opportunity to have a big game here, as USM has not done much against the rush, this year at all. He's one of my favorite plays because he's a little bit underpriced here, and that gives him a lot of utility. Then we're going to look at Frank Gore Jr. Obviously, he has some good pedigree here, though he's been somewhat inconsistent. If he can score a touchdown, he's likely going to pay off here. He's also quite a bit cheaper than the top 2 guys, and he's got the most rushing attempts on the season. He's closing in on the 400 yards here, and he has 4 touchdowns. He also has a touchdown through the air, he's one of the only ones. But he does face one of the tougher rushing defenses on this particular slate. Again, it's not the biggest risk there, but he definitely has some issue there. But he's had a couple 100-yard games in the last few weeks, and that does give him some utility here. The only real risk here is if Southern Miss were to fall behind early, then he may not get as many touches. But, I mean, even if you look at this season, he's really not had too much issue getting plenty of touches, especially the last 3 weeks where he's got number 20 and 3 straight, even though all 3 of those games were losses and one of those games was a blowout. So I expect him to have some utility here on the slate, and he's definitely a good contrarian option, especially given his price being nice and cheap. And then here comes another kind of contrarian wacky situation here for Jacksonville State, as their main running back who has tons of yards, is likely out today. He is very doubtful, and that will put Anwar Lewis into position. Now, he had a really solid game against Liberty late in the game where he had 15 attempts for 81 yards. He's definitely capable of a decent game. He's shown that he can have some good rushes on the season so far. He's had a couple over 20, and so he's definitely capable here. He also has a couple of passes through the air. but I do like his potential here. Um, and he had 8 touchdowns last season at the FCS level, so I look for him to have some utility on the slate. I do think that he's high risk, high reward, but he's also $4,200, which gives him a lot of utility on the slate. Obviously, the other two running backs we could look at is Step for Western Kentucky, but honestly, they don't run the ball enough. And then for MTSU, if Peasant misses the game, that does give Creedle a lot of utility, though he does face the toughest rush defense on the slate on this uh, at all. So I think he's probably pretty avoidable here. Looking at our wide receivers, we're going to go through team to team here. Now, MTSU is a team that I have liked to stack this season at wide receiver with Metcalf, Willis, and Olsen. These guys all get a pretty even amount of looks here, though Metcalf is leading the touchdown with 4. Willis has 2, and then Olsen has 1. But all three of these guys are going to have some pretty good amount of targets today, and I look for them to have some utility on the slate, though it is a tougher matchup than they normally get. As for Liberty, Daniels and Sibley are the top 2 options here. Now, Daniels is actually pretty fairly priced here, and he has a good reception potential. Now, Sibley has some moments where he does good, but he's inconsistent. So I do like both these guys a little bit today, but I don't love them. I think they're kind of contrarian options at best. And I don't think I would stack Liberty wide receivers. I might use one of them as a one-off, but that would pretty much be it. As for Western Kentucky, Corley and Messer are the top 2 options here. And Corley has some great utility as he's one of the few wide receivers on this slate with over 30 catches. He's one of just 3. He also has 5 touchdowns, which are second on the slate. And so he's a great option on this one, though he is very expensive at $7,800, and you're going to have to be paying down other places to roster him. Messer's a great contrarian option today as he has quite a few catches on the year at 24, and he has 3 touchdowns, and I think he's got some utility to have another touchdown in this game as Western will probably throw the ball a lot early, and he'll have to be involved to really pay off here. As for Jacksonville State, they're very avoidable on the slate with Carter and Lane being the top options. But Carter has some utility as he has over 300 yards on the season, but he's high risk, high reward, and I think they're pretty avoidable in general. As for USM, they may decide to try to throw the ball up more than they have this season, and with that, they have some pretty cheap options. Caston, Jones, and Mims are the top 3 guys here. Now, Jones actually has more yards than Mims, but he doesn't have the touchdowns. Uh, he's only had 1 touchdown so far, so Jones definitely has some utility, but he's had more catches than Mims. Mims is not getting a ton of yards. He does have some low end appeal, but he's high risk, high reward. And then Caston would be the safest play as he's got the most yards, catches, and 3 touchdowns on the season, and he's nice and cheap. I think using one of those guys as a one-off is definitely a viable option on the slate, but they are high risk as the situation there is a little bit dicey. Looking at South Alabama, this is where we get our wide receiver that we really like a lot in Lacey. Now Lacey obviously has 39 catches on the season, which is the most, and he's also got 6 touchdowns, which is the most on the slate as well at this position. So he has a lot of utility, though. Again, he's very expensive, just like Corley is, though he's actually a lot cheaper than Corley, so that gives us some utility. He's right at the same price as Metcalf from MTSU, and that gives him a lot of potential. Pritchett is also available. He's got almost 20 catches on the season, and his yards are pretty good at 251, but he only has 1 touchdown so far. Meanwhile, Lacey, he has 700 yards on the season, which is more than 200 more than anybody else on this slate. Corley comes in second at just a little over 500 himself. So I think this slate is pretty solid. The wide receivers are going to be tough, especially if you're going to pay up for quarterbacks. Running back has a lot of mixed value as they're a little bit underpriced today, which is helpful on the slate. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.